Are we going to talk about shapes today? Is that the plan?
Yeah. I've done my shapes presentation. How's your week been?
I'm ready to go back to kindergarten. It's been good.
Yeah, go on. I was just gonna say, in my eyes, like it like has like the Rugrats theme, like playing like as I'm doing the presentation.
That should be the intro music this week. No, my week's been good. My whole team is up. So like, well, up, down, left, right. They're from all over the place. So it's our first ever, like, everyone all in one city. I think everyone had kind of independently met each other through various means, but like having everyone in one place has been pretty cool. It's definitely a vibe.
Yeah, I think co-located teams in general are going to be superior in the future. It's just so much faster to get stuff done. Remote, like, I don't know. It like, we are fully remote, and I appreciate the benefits of it, but at the same time, I do miss co-located teams working together and just like getting stuff done. So, yeah, I get it.
Yeah. What do you think is actually missing in remote work?
I think it's the spontaneity of like being able to tap someone on the shoulder and be like, hey, what do you think of this? Or like, you know, what about this idea? And then I also think that coupled with the discipline of like going into the office and like getting stuff done because you have like everyone else looking over your shoulders, so you're getting stuff done. So you're not like as distracted sometimes. I know for me, like the motivation of like not looking like I'm not doing anything is quite high.
That's really interesting. I find the opposite. Like I find the office is great for the kind of work that you need to do that's not really doing much, where like you're just reading or taking calls or whatever. Whereas I find if I need to get, 8 hours of coding done, nothing beats being at home, turning off all my notifications and just going deep, going dark.
Fair. I think it depends if the task I'm doing is something I want to do or not want to do. If I don't want to do the task, I find it easier when I'm around people. But if it's something I want to do, then yes, I will sit here and do it by myself and not get distracted.
That's what my head of operations is for.
Yeah, fair. So I read Art of War by Sun Tzu because I've been quoting it my entire life and I've never actually sat down and read it. Have you ever read the book?
I've read some of it.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Just a lot of specific stuff around war tactics, around don't attack upstream, don't walk through a salt marsh. And I'm like, all right, well, 90% of this isn't super useful. It's interesting for sure, but for the amount of times it gets quoted and like people bringing it up, and the amount of practical advice in that book, I don't know if they match up.
I don't know. A diamond in the rough. Those quotes. I think people find it interesting because maybe that's the point. Like when you put it in context, when you think about it, it's this dude from however many millennia ago. I actually don't know how old it is. And being a wartime book, that any of its advice is relevant is kind of fascinating. Plus, business loves to be warish, right?
I think in general, people like to take advice from discipline A and bring it to discipline B to sound a bit smarter or like a bit fresh, like as a take and an opinion. It's like, oh, we can learn this thing from like how the Eskimos did their, I don't know, like how they connected with each other. We can bring this into our business and it sounds cool, right? Yeah. So,
or German war tactics.
Yeah. So I can totally understand why people use Art of War for business tactics and things like that. So, yeah.
I need to sit down and read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. That's another one that gets like lauded a lot. And I feel like it's like a seminal piece of writing.
Yeah, I might read that too. I just read Art of War and I'm reading the Etymologicon right now, which, to be honest, sounds cooler than it actually is. The first few chapters are interesting, and then it's just like, what is he talking about? I think there's certain things I find interesting, but then I have to read through I would say maybe 60% of things I find interesting. The 40% I don't. Or I don't know what he's talking about. So I'm going to sort of wade through that a little bit. I'm wondering if I should just skim read and read the parts I find interesting.
Someone's probably, if not, then you should get a digital version and feed this to GPT and ask it to just summarize all the funny word meanings, not meanings, like histories.
Yeah.
So for people who don't know, the Etymologicon is a book about where words come from.
Yeah.
My favorite one is, do you have a favorite one from there, from what you've read so far?
I think the point blank was interesting. So point blank comes from the fact that like the target used to be called the blank or the white of the target, not the bullseye. Bullseye is a more common term now, but you have to aim the bow and arrow slightly above the blank to like hit it, right? However, if you get close enough, you don't actually have to aim slightly above because it won't like curve down. It'll just go straight. So if you have that distance, it's quite called point blank because you're pointing at the blank directly rather than pointing slightly above it. I thought that was cool.
That is actually pretty cool.
Yeah. Do you remember that one?
I forgot that one. No, I mean, I read it so long. I read it like 4 years ago, and there's so many in there. And there's a sequel, and it's just...
I bought all 3 of his books. I got the Horologicon and the other one as well, whatever it's called. So, yeah, might read it at some point.
You gotta figure out where the word etymology comes from.
Yeah. All right, so got my shapes presentation. If you can see it here. So if you're not on YouTube, if you're listening by audio, I will talk about these things. But if you want my little interactive presentation, you're gonna have to come on YouTube. Maybe Loong can describe the slide.
Amazing! I just love the little picture of you smiling in the bottom left.
I did think about like cropping my face and putting in one of the shapes, but then I was like,
so much effort.
Yeah, so much effort. All right, so I've covered a few shapes, and I'll bring them up, and we can kind of talk about it. There's heaps of shapes out there. Actually, when I sat down to do the research, I was like, there are hundreds of shapes that are interesting from a scientific or engineering point of view. I picked a couple of standard ones and a couple of more out there ones, and if you find a shape or think of a shape that I haven't talked about, you can drop it in the comments and we can discuss it in a future episode, or just, we can continue the conversation in the comments. So the first shape, very straightforward. One of the first shapes we started using was squares and rectangles, right? So BCE, for context, is before Common Era. CE is Common Era. So it's the alternative to before Christ and after Christ. So in early Mesopotamian times or Egyptian societies, they used squares and rectangles to... they used it a lot in their designs, right? So the Great Pyramid of Giza is one example of this. It's just a bunch of blocks stacked together to create a pyramid. Pyramid also, great shape. What was really fascinating that I thought that in the Indus Valley civilization, so this is in Pakistan, around that area, they used a lot of grid formations. So these images here is some of the grid formations that they made. And they also made mud brick houses using standardized brick dimensions. So they had a fairly good idea of geometry when they were building the society. And this is like 3,300 BCE, which is ridiculously early. These images are the city of Mohenjo-Daro, and you can go visit this in Pakistan, actually. Yeah. So squares and rectangles. What are your thoughts on that shape?
I mean, squares are pretty intuitive shapes, right? Like I don't think you need a fairly sophisticated understanding of like the maths or engineering of geometry to know how to fit them together, at least on the 2D plane. I guess how you build them up. I mean, I don't know. I won't comment on the pyramid because there's too much to say about it, and I know nothing about it. Like, all I can do is wave my hands and be like, "Whoa, how did they do it?"
Yeah. So I think rectangles are straightforward. Squares, slightly more complex. You have to have some idea of geometry to be able to get those sides to equal each other. So the fact that they had standardized brick dimensions, I thought was quite impressive. Now we move on to the circle, which the first use case of the circle was not actually transportation. It was actually the potter's wheel. This is in the Neolithic era, 3,500 BCE. 3000 BCE is when the wheels started becoming a thing. And the very early wheels, as we all know, because there's so many movie representations and cartoon representations of it, was just a solid wooden chunk made into a solid disc. And that was the wheel. But I didn't know that the first use case was not transportation. It is actually a potter's wheel, which is interesting to me.
That is kind of interesting. I guess it would have changed transportation so fundamentally you would have needed like an intermediate use case to be like, oh, this thing's actually useful, maybe we can use it for other things.
Yeah, the wheel had such a big impact on warfare, on agriculture, on so many different things.
Do you know anything about the history of how it spread? Like, was it one of these things where one guy figured it out and then everyone's like, holy shit, wheels?
So when I looked into it, it just sort of had like different sprouts happening across this era, across Asia and Europe. So it's unclear if like, it spread from a single point or if they sort of came up with it independently and sort of these sort of things developed. I think at these early stages, it's really hard to figure out cause and effect or like how things were spread in a very like concrete way, unfortunately.
So like, I guess, is it worth putting this time period in context for people so they kind of have an understanding of like what was going on? It's like, this is kind of known as like the Bronze Age, right? This period of time. And sort of when you hear about the Bronze Age or like the ancient Egypt period or like, I guess it's post Neolithic Revolution, according to Wikipedia.
I think using wheels for the first time is a pretty good representation of where society was at. Like, it was such a big thing that like it did change the way the transportation was done, right?
The first iPhone had just been invented.
Yeah. So, just imagine a society pre and post wheel, and you can kind of get an idea for what it looked like. Yeah.
I wonder if that's an exercise for like people try to imagine society after like the turn of an amazing technology. Like right now, everyone's trying to ideate what society's going to look like post AI. Whether it's actually an interesting exercise to like pick a fundamental piece of technology and then try and imagine pre that technology, which is probably something you have equal experience trying to actually imagine. Like genuinely imagining a pre-wheel society is kind of wild.
Yeah, there's so many examples of this too. If you think about the Gutenberg printing press, right, that was a pretty big transformation as well. You think about CDs and how like music records were created for the first time. There's all these examples of really big technologies where the headlines were very similar to the AI headlines, which was like, no one's going to have a job, like, everything's going to go to shit. Like, it was a big thing. And I think this is like history has repeated itself several times in terms of this. Although the AI thing, I can understand the argument of it being slightly different, but we have had this fear and panic cycle happen over and over again when it comes to technology. So yeah, definitely interesting exercise. And I think we could draw dozens, if not hundreds of parallels to that in the past.
All right. What's after the wheel?
We have triangles. So triangles are close to my favorite shape. I've got a actual favorite shape that will come up a bit later. But triangles and trusses have been used since ancient times. In the medieval times, it's actually used quite extensively. So these frames over here at the very top of my screen on the image were medieval braces. So this is like cathedrals, things like that. And trusses are just really good shapes in general. If you add a diagonal to a square, it adds slightly more support and more rigidity so it can withstand forces and make it more robust. And it's been used for bridges, it's been used for buildings, all kinds of stuff. So trusses have been pretty fundamental in the development of human structures.
I think, yeah, this is a fairly complex shape because it's also not like fully symmetric in the same way that squares and rectangles and circles are. I never really, like, as a kid, I remember not understanding why adding a diagonal made things, like, more secure. Like, why is that? Can you actually explain that?
Yeah, so, I mean, just from a very simple perspective, like, if you were to add a diagonal and then, like, add a force arrow, to the right-hand side of this, or let's say the left-hand side of this, the force is now dispersed through the diagonal, not just through the shapes. The easiest way to imagine this is, like, if you had a square and you put a force on this vertex over here on the right, it would just sort of collapse, right? Because if you pushed it over, it would just shift to the side until it collapsed. The diagonal prevents it from collapsing, right? So it adds another vector for the force to go across. So it essentially makes the entire structure more rigid rather than falling over.
When we started using triangles for these, like for constructions, do you know if there was an understanding of like the actual mechanics involved, or whether people had just kind of figured out if I put a diagonal here, it works? Was there actually a mechanistic understanding?
So I think there was a good understanding of geometry and mechanics when it came to trusses. But yes, I'm sure the very first usage of trusses was that, the squares keeps falling over either side. Let's just add a diagonal and it'll stop falling over.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get slightly more complex with our shapes now. We're going to go to arches.
Wait, can I take a guess about what your favorite shape is? Or is that going to ruin the surprise?
Yeah, go for it. What do you think my favorite
is? It the hat tile?
The hat tile?
Yeah.
I don't even know what that is.
All right, fuck. It should be your favorite shape.
All right, maybe we can add to my shape presentation after this with a hat tile, whatever that is. All right, so we have arches, 3000 BCE. Mesopotamia was using arches, underground structures. Romans are the ones who kind of made arches mainstream. They didn't invent it by any means. It was actually invented a lot earlier than them. But they were the ones who perfected it and used it in the Colosseum and aqueducts. Arches are really interesting because they have this ability to distribute weight equally. So if you have a uniform distributed load on top of the arch, it will basically redirect the distribution of forces down the two arms, which make it a really interesting shape for carrying things and holding things up. So yeah, arches were a pretty significant development, especially in the Roman times.
That's pretty cool. Why do they layer the arches like this? So for people who can't see, he's showing a bridge of some kind. And it's got sort of multiple rows stacked on top of each other, and each with varying shaped arches.
Yeah, that one's interesting. I'm not sure why they've layered it. It could be aesthetic. It could purely be just due to the way that looks like it looks a little bit nicer to do that. It could be limitations on how big they can make the arches. Potentially, like they didn't have the capabilities to make an arch that goes all the way up there. So there could be various different things. Yeah. All right, then we move on to hexagons, which are a really interesting shape. So from a mechanical point of view or a material science point of view, they're really efficient from a perimeter to area benefit. So obviously they're most efficient in terms of the amount of material used for the perimeter, and the area is a circle, right? Just from a, like, if you have a string and you want to make the most efficient area to perimeter shape, it would be a circle. But if you use a hexagon, it has the ability to tessellate really well, and it has equal distribution of forces. So it's actually a really interesting shape to create very lightweight, strong materials that are really resistant to compression. So that's why we have things like honeycomb aluminium. I don't know if you've used that before. It's used sometimes in F1 cars and things like that to make it a little bit more robust.
Or just honeycomb, like, yeah. Just normal honeycomb.
Yeah, in nature we can see this just in normal honeycomb, and also carbon atoms in graphene, which form a hexagonal lattice. This is a really interesting shape. To be honest, hexagons are the reason I started this entire thing of like looking into shapes, because I was like, why do we use hexagons? It's such a random shape to use for materials, for various things like that, and sort of made me go into this rabbit hole in the first place.
I don't know. I feel like even without understanding that it evenly distributes forces, it does feel like not too counterintuitive. So like if you're building up from the number of sided shapes, the first sided shape you can think of is like a triangle. And that's not like rotationally invariant. Well, I guess it is. Anyway, squares, definitely out, because you can push them over, like you said. Like pentagons. Do pentagons tessellate?
I don't think pentagons tessellate.
Yeah. So then you're going to get to hexagons. It's like as one of the first shapes that's even like meaningful to use. And if you just took a bunch of squares and drew a bunch of triangles in them, they're only symmetric through certain rotations, whereas hexagons are symmetric much more. Or there are more forms of symmetry in like just a plane of hexagons.
Yeah, so yeah, regular pentagons don't tessellate. So yeah, it is just sort of this like weird optimization thing where it comes down to like, does it tessellate? Does it uniformly distribute the forces? Does it provide more area for the material that you're using? Various things like that. Triangles are great, but hexagons use slightly less material to create that area. Mm.
You see hexagons everywhere in chemistry. Like all of these aromatic rings like form into these hexagonal shapes, and they're fairly stable. Like you won't find them bending out of the plane too much. It's one of the signs that you've done something terribly wrong. Like, so when we're building, geometry optimizers and we run them, and then you just do a quick visual check to make sure nothing totally insane happened, and you see like a benzene ring that's bent, you're like, oh, that's wrong. Like, just my hexagon is not flat. Something went astray.
That is interesting. Why do you have any like hypothesis as to why like hexagons are so stable, like used a lot in chemistry. Not used, I guess, like occur a lot in chemistry.
I think it's symmetry, right? Like you need, if you want to alternate double and single bonds, you need an even number of points, right? So that means you need a square or you need a hexagon. And squares, as we said, they're not stable, right? The points are not equidistant in the same way that they are in a hexagon. And so really a hexagon's it's the lowest shape that meets both of those requirements, that has a high degree of symmetry and has an even number of points in it. And like, there's an incredible relationship between group theory, which is essentially just a study of symmetry, and chemistry. You can describe so much of chemistry using group theory. It's actually, when I first learned about that relationship, which is a very, very well understood relationship, it was just fascinating. It's something that is born out of just like pure mathematics, arguably one of the purest forms. And then it's just so fundamental to chemistry and physics.
Yeah, makes sense. That's interesting. All right, we're going to go into the next shape, which is one of the first shapes to be patented, kind of. And that's the I-bar, or the I-beam, or the H shape, essentially, which you've probably seen in engineering quite a lot. This is developed during the Industrial Revolution, patented in 1849 by Alphonse Halbert. Essentially, he patented the actual steel bars. That's what they're called at the time. I-beams and steel bars were called the same thing. These are really cool because they provide a very high strength to weight ratio, because obviously you don't have that extra material in the middle. You just have one bar. Instead of having a square, you have an eye, and essentially has very similar strength profiles to like just having a straight beam. The reason for that is because it's really good at dealing with shear forces in the plane of the web. So the web is the middle part. I think the side parts are called flanges. So if you have a shear force going down or up across the beam, it deals with that really well. And also bending moment, which is like, trying to flex it either way. So yeah, this is used to construct the Empire State Building. It's used in many constructions, still used today. Very important shape, I think, in developing the technology that we have today.
What stops the flanges just folding over? Like, why are they there?
Typically, you're talking about uniformly distributed loads across like this way, essentially. So it's a force coming down as opposed to two forces pushing down on either side of the flange to like bend it in.
So is the flange just there to stabilize it and not make it wobble?
The flange is there to basically make it uniform, like to put the forces across the flange as opposed to on a very small point. Obviously, if you put something on a very small point, it's going to cut into it, right? Whereas like providing a base allows the force to just sit there across the entire space, entire cross-sectional area. Not cross-sectional area, but surface area. Yeah. I did think this when I was like studying engineering and we talked about I-beams. I was like, whoa, like you can just fold it in that way. Like that doesn't make any sense, but they used essentially to put something on top of it. Yeah. Then we go into spirals and helixes. These are amazing shapes.
Oh, what a good shape.
Obviously used in the double helix structure for DNA.
We're getting to some premium shapes. So from this section on in the podcast, you need to be a subscriber to access these premium shapes.
These are actually very premium shapes. The next four shapes are very premium shapes. So
arguably the first shape in human history,
True. So what makes spirals and helixes really interesting is it distributes stress evenly and converts rotational motion into linear motion, which you've seen through a screw. So if you screw a screw, I guess that's how you say it.
If you turn a screw.
Yeah, if you turn the screw, you turn the rotational motion into linear forward motion as it goes deeper and deeper into the surface, essentially, right? So mechanically, that's what we typically use it for. But you also use it in springs, which turns you can turn kinetic energy into potential energy and then like sort of release it, right, in one fell swoop. So springs, screws, drill bits, DNA, super fascinating structures. And yeah, it's a whole shape in itself.
Do you know why DNA forms into these double helixes?
I have no clue.
As opposed to just being like straight.
I'm not sure.
I don't know either, but my guess from studying them is that when you rotate them, as you can kind of see in this picture, but I guess if you just visualize a ladder that's straight, the points on the ladder can't connect to each other than across the two strands. But when you start twisting it, suddenly you can form these bridges from the same edge of the ladder that can meet itself. Same with the spring, right? So you can kind of draw a line through that spring at the top and connect the spring to itself. But you wouldn't be able to do that if the spring was straight. Like it is you'd have to kind of curve around to connect the spring to itself, and that's not stable. So when you twist the helix, you can actually form these bonds, and and if you look at the structure, there are these sort of like bonds. I'm not super familiar with DNA, but I know, like, for example, proteins do this. They form into these alpha helices, and they spin around, and that allows it to sort of self-connect with itself through like these oxygen and hydrogen bonds, and that stabilizes the whole shape and stops it just flopping back and forth.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess it is structurally more stable if it's in a scrunched up sort of shape rather than a ladder, which can just flop around. And then it's got to scrunch up into a chromosome eventually, right? So that's like, the helix sort of bunches up into itself, and it forms these like localized clusters, and those localized clusters come together and it forms a chromosome end of the day, right? So it's all bunched up. So it has to be that way, I'm guessing. It probably also reduces the surface area for like mistakes to happen, because if a ladder is fully exposed and things can hit it, or like things can come across it, whereas a helix feels a little bit more protected in some way, right?
I never thought about that.
Yeah. I don't know if that's true. Just a hypothesis. Okay, now we get to my favorite shape, which is one of the reasons I found engineering really fascinating. Do you want to guess what it is? And it's not whatever you said before.
I already know that it's wrong, so...
It's a teardrop, right? So a teardrop is just a really fascinating shape. So it's nature's solution for minimizing resistance, right? So if you look at this diagram here, wind tends to sort of go around it and sort of rejoin towards the tail end of it, which makes it really fascinating. So it is really good for minimizing resistance. Now, for the most part, air resistance is not really much of an issue for like low speeds. So you don't need your car to look like this when you're just driving normally, because air resistance is fairly negligible at those speeds, right? Now, what's interesting is if you change the teardrop slightly, so if you bend it down to make this wing shape, what happens is you have something called the Bernoulli effect, right? And there's a correlation between velocity of airflow and the pressure created by that. Typically, the Bernoulli effect is applied to a pipe that has varying cross-sectional areas. If it reduces, it changes the pressure, essentially.
A brief intermission.
Hey guys, future AJ here, and if you're on YouTube, you're probably watching past AJ try to explain the Bernoulli effect, but it was slightly incorrect, so I wanted to make sure that I explained it properly. So what's actually happening is that Bernoulli discovered an inverse relationship between the velocity of airflow and the pressure. So when there's high velocity, there's low pressure. When there's low velocity, there's high pressure. And what happens with the wing shape is that the air still has to meet up with itself at the end of the wing in the same amount of time. So the air molecules that go above the wing and below the wing also have to meet up at the same amount of time. But because the distance is longer, if you just look at the perimeter of the top of the wing versus the bottom of the top of the wing is much longer. So if x is increased, the distance, the time is the same, velocity must increase to compensate for that. So what happens is that the airflow speeds up on the top of the wing and slows down or remains the same at the bottom of the wing. So it creates a high pressure field at the bottom and a low pressure field at the top. And so that difference in pressure causes lift, or like a force to be applied on the wing. So that's what causes the aircraft to go up. Now, if you move the teardrop shape slightly upwards so that the tip is higher up, then the inverse happens, so that the high velocity airflow is on the bottom, low velocity is on the top, and therefore the pressure difference causes a downward force. Now, this is used in F1 cars called the grounding effect to keep the F1 cars closer to the ground. So you may notice that some of the side parts of the car have that teardrop shape, but it's slightly in the opposite direction compared to an airplane. Hopefully that answers the question, and I'll hand it back to Loong and AJ.
So how come planes can fly upside down?
That's a good point. I think...
Or do they not? I mean, like, do they just fly up? I've never seen a plane fly upside down for a long period of time. Do they just kind of go upside down for a moment and then technically they're just falling?
I think they can change this part of the wing, right?
Oh, yeah, true. I guess they've got that little
so that's
flap thing
impacting the way that the air is flowing, and that's how they control it a little bit. So I think they can control lift and direction of lift that way. Yeah. Anyway, teardrops are awesome. Like, just...
Have you seen the Prince Rupert drop? I was expecting you to go Prince Rupert drop when you said teardrops.
Yeah, but Prince Rupert drops, like, they don't really have... That's the glass thing, right? That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, where you put, like, molten glass.
Yeah, I don't know what the engineering... I was going to put that in there, but I was like, what's the engineering use case of it? Besides it just looking cool.
You get really, really... Like, so it's one of the toughest... Like, it's one of the highest... I don't know what the right term is, but it can sustain the most force in one direction out of glass.
Yeah.
So if you want glass in a shape that's going to like be maximally strong.
And it has like one point of weakness, essentially, which is the tail part.
Yeah, which is like you just breathe lightly on the tail. And it...
But like, what do we do with that? Like, I
don't know, man. Yeah. Someone probably looked at this presentation a few hundred years ago and was like, what the fuck are we meant to do with these teardrops, AJ?
Yeah, well, I picked teardrops that you could actually use, which is, you know, to fly or to like keep your car grounded to the floor, things like that, you know. So, yeah, teardrops, amazing shape. Funnily enough, raindrops rarely actually form a teardrop shape because...
Well, I mean, that makes sense because they're, you know, not tears.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it... I'm not sure why we call it teardrops, but I guess like our tears sort of fall that way, I'm guessing. Yeah. Anyway, teardrops, awesome shape. Another awesome shape is a parabola, right? And a parabola is interesting for a couple of reasons, mainly for the mechanics of it. So, yes, it's a U shape that follows a quadratic function, but, and also, if you know Newtonian mechanics, if you throw a projectile, it will follow a parabola, assuming that there's no air resistance and follows uniform gravity, right? It will follow a parabola. So if you just throw a rock, it should go in a parabolic shape. What's interesting about a parabola is if you, say for a car headlamp, if you have a bulb in the center where the focal point of the parabola is, and it shines light, where it bounces on the parabolic mirror, it will always go straight, right? So you can see this diagram here where the bulb is in the focal point of the... I think the focal point should be slightly to the left, but that's fine. It's in the focal point, shines its light, bounces off, and it'll always go straight. So if you want a directional light, if you have a parabolic mirror and a bulb, it will do that, essentially. So that was like one of the coolest examples I learned when I was doing engineering for parabolas.
And I guess like you've got the picture of it, but this is why we use it for like giant dishes as well, because it does the opposite. So like a bunch of stuff coming in hits this parabolic shape and then it gets bounced back into the focal point. And so you put your detector at the focal point and everything else is just designed to make whatever it is that you're detecting, light, radio waves, whatever, bounce back to that point.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see on the top example, there's a detector in the focal point, so it's slightly higher up, and then you have your parabolic mirror, so everything that comes in will bounce towards that detector and sort of concentrate it to that. So telescopes work in a similar way too. If you want to have a really big telescope, and you want to concentrate the light that you're looking at for really vast distances into a smaller point, we can look with our eyes. Telescopes can do that using parabolic mirrors as well. And
parabolic microphones, are they same idea but sound?
Yeah. Parabolic microphones. So you can have directional sound, like you can essentially...
But sound is vibration.
Well, I mean, there's still waves.
That's kind of wild.
Yeah, there's still waves in the day. So yes, you can do the same thing with light and sounds like that.
You can do a wave shape.
Yeah. So have you heard of a catenary? So a catenary is very similar to a parabola, but slightly different. So you can see a catenary and a parabola side by side, right? It follows a slightly different mathematical formula, and they don't fully form the same thing.
Sorry, I feel like that's unfair characterization. That is a dramatically different mathematical formula.
Oh yeah. Sorry, dramatically different formula. Very similar looking curves, right? Now, the definition of a catenary is the curve formed by an idealized hanging chain or cable that assumes its own weight when supported by only at its ends. So if you look at this little chain here held by two poles, that is a catenary, right? So suspension bridges, you also have catenary arches. So if you use the shape of a catenary into an arch, you can form an arch. A parabolic arch, you can also form all kinds of different arches. But
why would I pick a parabolic arch over a catenary arch? Like, over just a circular arch?
So I honestly think it comes down to aesthetics. There is slightly different like weight distributions that would happen, and there's probably different efficiencies that you get from each one. But I was thinking about that question before doing this, and I couldn't really come up with a great answer for like why an engineer would pick a normal arch versus a parabolic arch versus a catenary arch. I think for the most part, it comes down to aesthetics. Yeah.
I can just imagine like you and me on a road trip and you've been like, look at that beautiful parabolic arch. So you're just like, that's a catenary arch, you fool. Can't you see the like fucking 3 millimeter difference?
Yeah, 100%. But now when someone goes with you on like the Golden Gate Bridge and it's like, oh my God, look at those parabolas. You'd be like, no, it's a catenary actually.
Get out of this car.
Yeah. So it's the wrong shape. Yeah. Anyway, that's the shapes I've got for you. There are more cool shapes. Got like a toroid over here.
Bro, you missed the coolest fucking shape. I'm real sad for you.
All right, show me the shape. Do you want me to bring it up?
Yeah, let me send you the link because my screen sharing never works. So the idea here is a single shape, one shape that tessellates but never repeats. So there is no translational or rotational symmetry in the plane, which is fucking crazy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense.
Like as a statement. Yeah. And so they went through this period of like finding these different shapes, and they found one that required a flip as well. So it's like, it's the same shape, but occasionally it appears flipped. And then people made the argument that that's not actually the same shape. Like from a group theory perspective, it's not like a rotation or translation of the shape. You actually have to flip the shape. And so they actually ended up coming up with a new one that was very similar, but turns out didn't need that flipping, just translating and rotating the shape. You could get it to tessellate the plane. But yeah, there's no rotational or translational symmetry. And apparently that's super cool for designing materials, because then you can create insanely strong materials that don't have any weak points.
This is awesome. I did not know about this.
And it's new. That's the cool thing. We discovered it like last year.
Yeah, discovering a new shape is wild. So now this is actually amazing because we've done the past of shapes and how we've developed it, and now we have a future shape.
Where are shapes going? What's next for shapes?
Deep tech of shapes. Jesus Christ. Yeah, this is so cool.
And the coolest thing is this has been an outstanding problem for ages. Like the hypothesis of such a shape that could achieve this. And it was just some random dude who got super into shapes. This is your future, AJ.
A non-professional mathematician who describes himself as an imaginative tinkerer of shapes.
Yeah, and he's just like, oh, I found it. And then all these mathematicians like, can we prove this? And then they did. And then they had the issue with the flipping. And then he proved it again. And then even better. So the shape that he discovered, they proved was on a continuum of shapes, all of which actually turn out to have this property, which is even cooler.
Oh, wow.
In my view. Yeah.
Wait.
So it wasn't like they found this just like one aperiodic monotile. They proved that the aperiodic monotile was on this sort of, continuum of aperiodic monotiles. And this was just like one particular instantiation of that series. And I think he found two series. So it's just like, not only did he find the aperiodic monotile, but he found like whole classes of these things.
Wow. Yeah, this is awesome. Yeah, I'm really curious if there's any specific applications that come out of it from material science and mechanics. Like, are we going to start having tile materials? Like, it's going to be interesting.
One then has to figure out how to actually like make like a physical monotile that's not actually just made of other shapes, right? Because there's no point just making it out of a bunch of triangles. So the question is there a material that you can coerce into like a faithful physical representation of the monotile?
Yeah.
Anyway, that is the correct answer to the best shape.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you win. I don't think I can beat that. Although my one argument for the teardrop would be that there is still a lot more applications of the teardrop versus the hat tile right now.
Yeah, that's true. There are no applications for the monotile yet.
I think it's fascinating that there's so many like random topics like this that people don't really think about in the day to day, which can have such like interesting implications to it, right? So some guy just decided to dive into shapes and come up with his own shape, which I thought was awesome. So you just gotta find various like threads to pull like this that we can discover things in.
It's so, I mean, like just the statement itself is so bizarre, right? Like inventing a new shape. The fuck? His Twitter bio might better be like shape inventor.
I was thinking like, it's cool that someone patented, essentially a shape. That's why I put the fact out, but this guy's actually created a shape, which is amazing.
What's the difference? I mean, where is the line between discovering a shape and inventing a shape? Is it just like whether it occurs naturally?
Oh, now we're getting into the topic of mathematical realism, which I'm happy to dive into at some point. But it comes down to whether...
I'm sorry, what is that?
So mathematical realism is the conceptual study of just like the thought experiment of like, do we discover math or do we invent math? Like, does math naturally occur in the world? And like, would every society, like alien society, look at the world and be like...
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
I don't think
it's a tool created by humanity to describe things.
I think there are some pretty good arguments that it's not. Yeah.
I think there's some good arguments as to it is, right? Like just like some of the naturally occurring things, like how you think about like mathematical constants like pi, right? Or E, which like almost come naturally to the universe, like these constants, and you're like, okay, well,
almost, but
yeah. There is if you search it on YouTube, there are definitely a lot of arguments for and against.
We've just got to do a debate, like one versus the other.
Yeah, I am stuck in the middle. I don't think there is an answer to that question. It's kind of hard to answer, but I'm happy to do the debate at some point. We should do a debate episode in general. Just
my blind adherence to Deutschian philosophy means that I'm not allowed to believe in mathematical realism. I have to believe that physics is the most fundamental force, and that maths is a human emergent property of physics.
Yeah, that's fair. I can get behind that logic, or I can not get behind it if you want me to play the other side. Cool. All right. Well, that's all I got for you. Anything else you want to chat about before we wrap up?
No, I think it was cool that you threw the helix in there. I love that. Arguably the first shape invented for humans. I don't know which way to phrase it, but that's also a good candidate for a favorite shape. 3D shapes. I don't know if that's cheating.
Yeah. I think that the very first shapes would be more spherical or ellipsoid, right? Like planets and stars, and those seem to be fundamentally the shapes that the universe starts with, and then you sort of bring other shapes into it afterwards, essentially.
I guess the thing I'll leave our audience with is if shapes interest you, then group theory is the field of mathematics that actually governs these kinds of things. I guess maybe topology, but that's a different kind of shape. So yeah, if you want to Google something and get into some weird maths, that's the thing to Google.
Yeah, mathematical topology was my least favorite subject in university. It was the only subject I got a 51 in and barely scraped a pass because I just didn't understand the topic whatsoever.
You get a 40 in everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, I did not enjoy it because I did theoretical physics, and part of that you have to do math as part of it, and I did not enjoy my math subjects as much as my physics subjects, but I had to do it. And one of them, which is the worst one, was mathematical topology, which was just like this weird, like, math for the sake of math. Like, pure math to me, I never really got behind it. It's just like...
All right, I'll send you some videos because there are some really great examples of real world problems that have been solved through the field of topology.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe if my lecturer started with that, it's like, hey, here's why what you're learning is super important. Now let's learn it. I think that's how teachers should do things in general. But yeah, like when I teach my year 9 kids, like,
I'm gonna note you didn't do that with shapes.
Well, I was
you're just like, here it is.
My point was with my year 9 children when I was teaching them differentiation. I was like, hey, we're learning this because differentiation helps us calculate speeds of things and helps us discover the rates of changes of things. And this is why things are really important. And here's some jobs that would use it and like how you use it in everyday life. And then we start talking about differentiation. And I think that explaining the why and how it's actually working and things like that ended up helping them understand differentiation in a totally new light versus I know when I learned differentiation, I didn't understand why we were doing it. We're just like,
it was also, if you look at the history of the discovery of integration, that's actually how he got there. That's why Newton is so credited with discovering, like, is why he ended up being one of the people that was able to contribute so deeply to calculus, was because he had come at it from this classical physics perspective. He was already deep in the idea of, like position versus speed versus acceleration. And it was literally like that sort of like intuition around, okay, well, if I want to think about my graph as a graph of a physical phenomenon, then the area is just going to be, the distance that I've traveled, which means it's, and he was able to start relating these things together. And that was what gave us the fundamental theorem of calculus, which is that if you differentiate, then you can go back into the other direction by integrating. And that those two things are fundamentally linked, that you can't think about the area under a graph without thinking about the rate of change of the graph, that they're intrinsic to each other. Because we had both, but no one had really proven that, like, they were so deeply related.
Yeah, very true. I have had this idea for a while of doing a math class for startup founders because I've found that, like...
That's a fantastic idea. Except that it already exists. It's called 3 Blue, 1 Brown.
Wait, does it?
No, not literally, but I mean, it's just...
Oh, it's just a resource.
It's just a really great resource for learning maths.
I think core mathematics is an underrated, like, ability sometimes, and I've just met a lot of people working in the tech industry, and I'm like, oh, man, I just want to do like a really basic math lesson on how probabilities work, how areas work, and how you can apply it to what you're doing at work. And yeah, I've had this idea for a while, haven't had time to execute on it, but maybe we'll do it. Maybe I'll do it in technocracy, just math lessons. We just publish it.
I'm down for that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. Loong, what's the technocratic oath?
So, despite my joke in the middle, this podcast is actually free. We gave you access to premium shapes today. We didn't just give you the shitty free shapes. We didn't just stop at hexagons. And the way that you're going to pay us for this amazing content is by liking, subscribing, and then sharing this podcast with at least one person, ideally 6 in honor of the hexagon. And yeah, that's the technocratic oath.
We'll give you a discount. You can do 5 because you can be the 6th vertex. And then, yeah, just invite 5 people to become part of your hexagon.
That's fair.
Yeah, no one wants to be a line. No one wants to be a triangle or a square. Or even a pentagon. They don't even tessellate. They want to be a hexagon, so...
Yeah, take that 16% discount and run with it.
All right, thanks, guys. Catch you in the next episode.